All right, guys, I'm hoping to have this be the last video. I've got a couple pages to read. Um, when we left off, Ellen finally made it to the Jolly Fox Tavern, and she was able to give the loaf to Mr. Shannon, who left quickly to go take it to the next courier. And then she was in the room with Mrs. Shannon. Remember that little secret room they went in? Mrs. Shannon was kind of putting the fire on, and that's where we left off. When Mrs. Shannon turned to Ellen, she was smiling. She put her hands on her shoulders and looked into her eyes. "Now tell me your real name, young lady." "Why," Ellen cried in surprise, "I'm Mr. Shannon put her arms around her. "Never did I see a boy make such a pretty curtsy as you made a few minutes ago." So if you remember, when Mr. Shannon stood up, Ellen curtsied to him, but she wasn't thinking because she's a boy. She's supposed to shake his hand. Ellen gasped. Had she curtsied? How could she have been so stupid? It must have been her stocking feet that made her forget her disguise. "I just don't know," she stammered. Mr. Shannon's eyes were shining proudly as she looked at her. "Tell me your name," she begged. "Well," Ellen admitted, since there was no reason to be secret any longer, "my name is Ellen Toliver." Mr. Shannon chuckled, and then she burst out laughing and quickly covered her mouth with her hands. "Oh, the things we do to fool those redcoats," she giggled. "All day long I pretend I'm a loyal subject of the king, out there in the tavern, singing away like a bird in a cage, and you pretend you're a boy with nothing but a loaf of bread in your kerchief." She patted Ellen's cheek playfully. "But we fool them, don't we, Ellen? And we get important messages through the lines to our army." Ellen felt so good and so relieved. So Mrs. Shannon, standing in there, serving the redcoats, with her little flag in her hair and singing all those songs, she's just pretending, right? She's pretending to be on the redcoat side, on the British side, so that she could maybe pass information, so she can overhear maybe some plans that the British might have. Okay. Ellen felt so good and so relieved. Thinking how she fooled everyone, she began to laugh. She was carried away by such gales of laughter she had to stuff the green apron in her mouth to keep from being heard in the tap room. She felt silly with the apron in her mouth, but she just could not stop. Every time they looked at each other, the plump little woman with a flag in her white hair and the girl in leather breeches and a boy's jacket, they burst out laughing again. Mistress Shannon took time to bring Ellen a hot pot pie from the kitchen to eat in front of the fire. Then she brought a mug of warm milk, and next a shawl to wrap about her legs that she had hung after she had hung her stockings by the fire. Every time she came back, Ellen told her more of the story about Dow and his eagerness to eat the bread, and the pig, and how Mistress Murdoch almost stole her breeches. Now that she was safe, Ellen could hardly believe the things that she told Mistress Shannon. They seemed so far away already. Suddenly she could hardly hold her eyes open. Mistress Shannon pulled a trundle bed from under the big bed and put a heavy blanket on it. She gave Ellen one of her nightgowns and a nightcap and bustled about the room, carefully spreading out Ellen's clothes to dry. "You are snug and safe now, Ellen," she said softly. "We'll send you back home early tomorrow morning." Ellen fell heavily into the comfortable bed. Sleep came so quickly she barely heard Mistress Shannon call to her from the doorway. "You've earned a good night's rest, Ellen Toliver." Long before sunrise, Mistress Shannon brought Ellen's dry clothes to her. The shoes were still wet, but her feet would be snug in an extra pair of woolen stockings. "No more adventures today, Ellen," she said as she stirred up a good fire and put a breakfast of hot porridge and sausage on the table. Mr. Shannon came in and sat beside Ellen. "The courier left last night, Ellen," he told her, "with the bread in his saddlebag. By now the second courier should be near the third man. It takes a chain of people to carry a message across the countryside quickly." "It's dangerous, isn't it," said Ellen, "to ride through enemy country?" "Well," he admitted, "it is dangerous, but it's no more dangerous than fighting in the army. I'm too old to fight. Most of us are old men or women who carry messages sewn in their clothes, or boys too young to fight." He leaned over and patted her arm. "Or a girl like you. Your link in the chain didn't break, Ellen, and we're all glad about that." It was worth going through all the troubles of yesterday to hear him say that. Mr. Shannon carried a burning torch to light their way to the little river that went from Elizabeth to the bay half a mile away. At the dock, several boats were being loaded with barrels of food for the market house in New York. "We'll send you home with Grimsby, who is our good friend," said Mr. Shannon. "He's taking a big load of Christmas greens to town." But when the war's over, Mr. Shannon added, we hope you'll come back for a peaceful visit to Elizabeth. Will you come and bring your grandfather? Oh, yes, Ellen promised. You may be sure of that. She felt the Shannons were her good friends. Mr. Shannon spoke to the two leather-faced sailors. Take good care of this youngster. This is a very special person. Grimsby and Gallup made a seat for her among the bundles of pine and spruce boughs. There's a brisk breeze this morning, they told her while they crowded her legs with greens. Won't take long to get back to New York. They've got Christmas trees in the boat. That's what she's riding with. The sky grew pink, and the torches sputtered out. They were off. In no time, the boat sailed down the little river past the swampy marshes and into the big wharves at the shore. It was not long before Ellen recognized the shoreline of Staten Island. Why, we sailed past here yesterday, she said to herself. We must have been quite near Elizabeth before we sailed on to Perth Amboy. She shrugged her shoulders the way grandfather sometimes shrugged his. But I never would have seen how the enemy is getting ready in Perth Amboy. Mr. Shannon wanted me to tell him about that. The day turned out to be cheerful, with a great arc of blue sky and a bright sun overhead. Not at all like yesterday, except for the men singing. Ellen liked to listen to the songs Grimsby and Gallup sang while they handled the sails and the tiller of the old boat. Sing right up, boy. Oh, my name is Captain Kidd, who has sailed, he sang out. Ellen sang the refrain, who has sailed, who has sailed. Ellen was standing by the mast, singing at the top of her voice when their scow sailed up the East River and wound its way among the boats that were anchored there. Snow lay white on the roofs of the gabled houses, and the sun glinted from the church spires. New York looks good, she said to Grimsby, and she meant it. Grimsby and Gallup waved to her as she hopped off the boat. Soon she was running along the street and pushing her way through the crowds. They were the same crowds as yesterday, the same noisy men in wheelbarrows. She wasn't afraid of them. They were all going about their affairs, just as she was. She ran in and out of the crowds, laughing to herself. She wasn't a rabbit anymore, so she wasn't feeling shy and timid anymore, right? She was kind of like, got this bravery to her. She felt like singing as she climbed up the steps and burst into her grandfather's shop. She pushed past two British officers and past her grandfather's shaver, Alexander, who had a big bowl of soap suds in his hand. She was so happy to be home she would have smiled at the leeches if she had thought to. Grandfather's face lit up when he saw her. Rising from his couch, he hopped after her to the kitchen and locked the door behind him. I did it, cried Ellen in a loud whisper. I did it, I did it. She grabbed her mother's hands and they whirled around together while Grandfather waved the crutch the carpenters had made him. He would have danced too if he had 2 feet. Over and over they hugged her. We're so happy you're home. Pulling up chairs to the big table, they sat down to hear all about her trip. You found the farmer's boat without trouble? Grandfather asked in a whisper. Trouble, groaned Ellen. I had nothing but trouble all day long. Mother and Grandfather looked at her in surprise. They could hardly believe the whispered tale she told them. Perth Amboy was filled with cannon and wagon trains and hundreds of soldiers, said Ellen. Mr. Shannon told me that General Cornwallis was there in Perth Amboy getting ready to finish off our army before winter sets in. That's what we feared, Grandfather said. But did you get the message to Mr. Shannon? Yes, I did, and now I understand why it's so important for couriers to take messages to our army. I had no idea it would be so hard for you, Ellen, said Grandfather. I don't know whether I would have sent you had I known. But I myself never would have been able to get through all the lines at all. No one would have smuggled a fat old man on a boat. His eyes twinkled. Mother leaned across the table and smiled. I'm proud of you, Ellen, but I hope you'll never have to do this again. Well, said Ellen as she thought that over, I think maybe I'd do it again. I don't know. I guess I'd do it again if the boat was sure to go to Elizabethtown. It seemed to Ellen that 2 good things happened to her after her trip to New Jersey. The first thing happened the next morning when she wrapped her red cloak around her and went to the pump early. Ellen took her place at the end of the line to wait her turn. Do you remember who that bully was at the pump that always used to mess with Ellen? Remember Dicey from the beginning of the story? The women were still talking about the high prices of food and the high price of firewood. It seemed to Ellen that she had been away 100 years. It's only been a day. And they were still talking about the same old things. Then Dicey came by. Her face grew red with anger when she saw Ellen. Are you here again? She cried as she walked slowly, heavily towards Ellen. Yes, I'm here again. Ellen put down her bucket. She was ready to duck out of the way if Dicey came too close, but she was not afraid of her. My computer fell, sorry. She was not afraid of her. She folded her arms across her chest. Dicey growled. I told you not to come here, Miss Fine Lady. Ellen thrust her chin out and stared at Dicey. This pump is near my house, she said calmly, and I intend to use it, no matter what you say. Woo, look at Ellen getting tough. Dicey stared back, but she came no further. For almost half a minute they stared at each other. Then Dicey shrugged and turned away. You're just lucky I'm not ready for a fight, she called over her shoulder. But then she walked away. The second good thing that happened was a month later. Grandfather's silver snuff box came back to him by way of a secret courier. In it was a message that gave them wonderful news. General Washington's small army had crossed the Delaware River from Pennsylvania to New Jersey on Christmas night and had taken the city of Trenton by surprise. Washington had been able to plan a surprise attack because he had learned so much about British plans from the patriots in New York and the couriers who had carried their messages. Then he and his army had moved on to another victory at Princeton in early January and had time to fortify winter headquarters in Morristown behind the hills in New Jersey. And there was news of Ezra Toliver, that's her brother. He was a sergeant now, and he was safe and well in Morristown. They hugged one another for joy when they heard that. In the snuff box there was also a folded piece of paper marked, For Toliver. To Ellen's surprise, she found inside a silver locket, tiny little silver locket. She never knew who sent it to her, but since she didn't know, she liked to pretend it was from General Washington himself. And who knows, maybe it was. And that's the end. So that Christmas night attack where they gained Trenton, right, where George Washington crossed the Delaware River, not far from where you live, that was the attack that Ellen talked about. That's what her message was able to help with, okay? So I hope you enjoyed this story. On Google Classroom, you're going to see the response that I want you to answer to me. But that's it. That was Tolliver's Secret. And we are going to talk about a little bit how Ellen changed from the beginning to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. All right, bye.